Show map, welcome back to our ongoing investigative documentary series. In episode 6, we examine the contentious intersection of global climate rhetoric, sovereign energy security, and the persistent developmental imperatives facing emerging economies across the global south. Timeline: the foundational architecture of international climate diplomacy was established at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, where the UNFCCC formally codified the crucial principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Document highlight: following Rio, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol set legally binding emission reduction targets exclusively for developed Annex I nations, deliberately exempting developing powerhouses like India and China to reflect historical responsibility. Infographic: at the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Conference, industrialized nations pledged to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 to support climate mitigation and adaptation across developing countries. Data visualization: independent assessments by Oxfam and financial experts reveal that a significant portion of delivered climate finance consisted of high-interest loans rather than direct grants, exacerbating developing nation debt burdens. Show map: for ordinary citizens across developing regions, climate finance shortfalls translate directly into underfunded adaptation projects, leaving vulnerable coastal and agricultural communities exposed to extreme weather events without promised international support. Show map: geographically, India relies heavily on domestic coal reserves located across major mineral belts like Tal Sher, Korba, and Juria, which provide essential baseload power for industrial scaling and domestic electrification. Archival photo: memorialized in official policy documents, India's Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change consistently emphasizes energy equity, poverty eradication, and historical emissions accountability over arbitrary phase-out deadlines. Data visualization: a lesser-known verified fact highlights the stark disparity in per capita emissions. India's annual emissions stand at roughly 1.9 to 2.0 tons per person, compared to over 14 tons in the United States. Comparison: comparing national contributions, China accounts for approximately 30% of global annual carbon emissions, the United States for roughly 11 to 13%, and India for approximately 7 to 8% despite supporting 1.4 billion people. Document highlight: adopted at COP21 in 2015, the Paris Agreement introduced nationally determined contributions, shifting the global climate architecture from top-down binding mandates to a voluntary pledge and review framework. Archival photo: negotiating teams from developing coalitions, including the like-minded developing countries and Basic Group, successfully defended developmental space within Paris Agreement texts, emphasizing historical equity principles. Timeline: key subsequent milestones include the 2021 Glasgow COP26, the 2022 European energy crisis, the 2023 UAE consensus at COP28, and the 2024 Baku negotiations centering on the new collective quantified goal for climate finance. Show map: India's domestic energy strategy balances aggressive renewable expansion such as the massive Badla solar park in Rajasthan with the practical necessity of coal-fired baseload generation to prevent catastrophic grid failures. Infographic: energy economists emphasize that while levelized costs for solar and wind have dropped dramatically, intermittency and energy storage limitations require reliable baseload power to sustain heavy industrial manufacturing. Show map: across the European Union, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine instantly shattered prevailing energy assumptions, forcing member states to temporarily restart mothballed coal plants and scramble for liquefied natural gas. Archival photo: official statements from Western capitals during the 2022 crisis demonstrated that immediate energy security superseded long-term climate rhetoric when domestic heating and industrial survival hung in the balance. Document highlight: when critics question India's continued utilization of coal, Indian policymakers point directly to these Western emergency waivers, noting that energy security is treated as non-negotiable in Europe but scrutinized in the global south. Show map: at COP26 in Glasgow, intense last-minute negotiations led by India successfully shifted the pact's language from an abrupt phase-out of coal to a more realistic phase-down of unabated coal. Archival photo: Indian Environment Minister Bhupender Yadav articulated the core rationale at Glasgow, arguing that developing nations are entitled to use fossil fuels responsibly while lifting millions out of poverty. Infographic: data from the Energy Institute Statistical Review demonstrates that global primary energy consumption remains approximately 80% reliant on fossil fuels, proving that the global transition is a gradual structural evolution. Show map: global renewable capacity additions surged past 500 gigawatts in 2023, driven heavily by massive solar installations across China, the United States, and India according to International Energy Agency reports. Document highlight: the UAE consensus adopted at COP28 in Dubai explicitly called for transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems, yet recognized transitional fuels and national sovereignty in pathways. Show map: while Western think tanks argue that green energy reduces geopolitical dependencies, critics note that moving away from oil cartels replaces hydrocarbon reliance with severe geographic concentration in critical mineral supply chains. Infographic: midstream processing of critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements is overwhelmingly dominated by China, which controls between 60 and 90% of global refining capacity. Show map: geographically, critical mineral extraction is heavily concentrated in vulnerable regions, including cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo and lithium across the Andean salt flats of Chile, Argentina, and Australia. Comparison: comparing the old petrostate order with the emerging green economy, energy security experts warn that maritime choke points and mineral export restrictions pose new strategic vulnerabilities. Archival photo: the United States Department of Energy balances massive domestic fossil fuel production, making the U.S. the world's leading oil and gas producer with public investments in clean energy via the Inflation Reduction Act. Document highlight: European trade policies, particularly the carbon border adjustment mechanism, face sharp criticism from emerging economies who view the tax as a protectionist barrier disguised as environmental progress. Show map: India's commercial corridors and industrial exporters argue that CBAM imposes unfair cost burdens on developing manufacturing sectors that lack historical emission footprints, sparking robust diplomatic pushback. Infographic: China's National Development and Reform Commission maintains a dual strategy, dominating global green technology manufacturing while continuing to approve and operate domestic coal-fired power plants for grid reliability. Show map: as global energy demand hits record highs driven by artificial intelligence expansion, data centers, and extreme weather events, governments face acute friction between net zero targets and power blackouts. Timeline: the November 2024 COP29 summit in Baku centered directly on a new collective quantified goal for climate finance, exposing deep fractures between donor nations and recipient developing states. Document highlight: developing nation blocs at Baku rejected proposed financial baselines as inadequate for actual adaptation costs, arguing that historical compensation obligations remain largely unfulfilled by industrialized contributors. Show map: India's renewable corridor initiatives along the western coastline, combined with massive solar parks in Karnataka and Rajasthan, demonstrate that national climate commitments are met through concrete infrastructure rather than rhetoric. Infographic: official energy statistics confirm that India has successfully achieved its non-fossil fuel electricity capacity targets years ahead of schedule, while simultaneously managing surging industrial power demand. Archival photo: international observers acknowledge that India's pragmatic approach successfully harmonizes energy security with emissions reduction, avoiding the economic disruptions witnessed in over-accelerated Western transitions. Document highlight: however, ongoing disagreements persist over the precise definition of abatement in fossil fuel phase-down agreements, as carbon capture and storage technologies remain unproven at commercial scale. Show map: European energy transit corridors have shifted dramatically since the loss of Nord Stream pipelines, creating heavy reliance on American and Qatari liquefied natural gas imports across maritime routes. Comparison: comparing energy procurement strategies, while European nations pivoted rapidly to expensive imported LNG following Russian supply cutoffs, emerging economies utilized diversified supplier agreements to cushion price shocks. Archival photo: the Ministry of Power in New Delhi frequently highlights that domestic grid expansion and electrification programs are essential humanitarian milestones that cannot be halted by external diplomatic pressure. Infographic: statistical modeling by the IEA indicates that achieving net zero emissions by 2050 requires unprecedented international technology transfer and multi-trillion-dollar financing flows that have not yet materialized. Show map: across the global south, nations emphasize that climate rhetoric must be matched by tangible financial transfers and intellectual property sharing rather than unilateral trade penalties and emissions conditionalities. Document highlight: academic consensus compiled in IPCC reports underscores that while deep emissions cuts are physically necessary, economic transitions must protect energy access for billions living in developing regions. Archival photo: diplomatic communiques from G7 summits routinely reaffirm commitments to climate leadership while simultaneously negotiating emergency fossil fuel contracts to stabilize domestic inflation. Show map: India's strategic positioning bridges the gap between ambitious global climate goals and sovereign developmental necessities, asserting that equity is the only viable foundation for lasting international agreements. Infographic: Detailed trade data confirms that India's energy import basket remains diversified across Middle Eastern crude, Russian supplies, and expanding renewable installations, insulating the economy from single-source shocks. Show map: As critical mineral supply chains concentrate heavily in Asian processing nodes, Western economies face the ironic prospect of trading old petroleum dependencies for new technological bottlenecks. Archival photo: Official statements from international energy forums increasingly acknowledge that no single transition pathway fits all nations, validating India's persistent insistence on differentiated national timelines. Document highlight: The evidence compiled across decades of climate negotiations reveals a recurring tension. Public rhetoric prioritizes rapid decarbonization, while operational policy prioritizes immediate lights-on energy security. Show map: For India, navigating this friction requires maintaining aggressive renewable scaling alongside reliable baseload power, ensuring that economic growth and energy access proceed without compromise. Infographic: Comprehensive data from the IEA and Energy Institute confirms that while clean energy investments are accelerating exponentially, fossil fuels will remain part of the global energy mix for decades. Archival photo: As international climate diplomacy matures, the lessons of Rio, Kyoto, Paris, and Baku underscore that sustainable transitions depend entirely on mutual accountability, financial fairness, and technological sharing. Show map: The evidence is clear. Energy security and climate action are not mutually exclusive, but reconciling them requires dismantling double standards and honoring historical equity commitments across all nations. Timeline: In our next episode of Double Standards and India, Evidence Files, we turn our investigative lens toward global semiconductor ambitions, supply chain resilience, and the geopolitical race for microchip supremacy. Show map: Thank you for watching this evidence-based investigation into energy security and climate rhetoric on the Heroes channel. Join us next time as we continue uncovering the verified facts shaping India's rise in global geopolitics.